Welcome to the Samueletini Show, where business, innovation, and sustainability converge to drive progress. Are you ready to uncover solutions shaping our future? Let's dive in.
Welcome to a new episode. Today, we are going to discuss again B Corp, social business, and the work of how the stakeholder capitalism is really reshaping our work. And we do it with one of the maximum experts, somebody who is also a friend, call it a friend. I'm here, I'm pleased to have today Professor Christopher Marquis. Christopher, it's such a good pleasure having you today.
Yeah, Samuel, always great to chat with you. Really looking forward to our discussion.
And Chris, I mean, for the people who don't know, you have been at Harvard, now you are at Cambridge, started B Corp, China business. Can you give us maybe a 1 minute? I mean, who is Professor Marquis?
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, I'm an academic. I study sustainable business, broadly speaking, and obviously B Corps are an important example of that. I've been, professor for about 25 years. Currently at Cambridge, I've been here for about 4 to 5 years, although as people might be able to tell from my accent, I'm American, and most of my life I've spent in the US.
Fantastic. And really, your definition was your milestone work on better business. That really was a turning point in the B Corp movement. You have argued, now it's 6 years, so 6 years down the line, it seemed in 2020 an unstoppable movement. So before going in depth and see how the movement has evolved, I want to know, what is B Corp? Can you define it for the people that are still not familiar with it?
Sure. Yeah. So a B Corporation is a company that is certified for its social and environmental performance. There's a certification body, B Lab, which now is actually founded 20 years ago. It was founded in 2006. And so now we're now the 20-year anniversary of B Lab. And I think that, you mentioned Unstoppable Movement when I wrote the book in 2020. And I think, the impact of B Lab and B corporations continues to really grow, although in different ways. I think that, the title of my book, it was called Better Business, but, how the B Corp movement is remaking capitalism. And, the movement word was chosen very, very intentionally, because I do think it's about a lot more than just the B Corps per se. So, there's this global set of B Corps. Now there's about 10,000. When I started studying B Corps, there was about 200 or so. And in 2009 is when I started. My students actually are the ones that introduced me to the concept. And there's many other sort of areas that I think there's been a tremendous amount of progress made in. So in my book, I talk about sort of two pillars in some ways. One is an accountability pillar, which relates to, like broadly speaking, ESG measurement and reporting. And that is used, there's a B impact assessment that is used. Companies, in the past have had to get over a certain threshold, 80, to become a B Corp. But really the point that I make in the book is that this is something that all companies can be engaging in. They can use the B impact assessment. It's a free, publicly available tool. It's used by a lot of investors. Even though there's only now about 10,000 B Corps, there's hundreds of thousands of companies that use that tool to help measure and manage their organizations. Another really important pillar is governance. So this relates to the fact that actually around the world, the traditional definition of companies actually puts shareholders as the primary constituents, so the owners of the company. And through a variety of work, or company laws, legal changes, there is now a type of company called a benefit corporation, which actually balances that out so that other constituencies, be they employees or the environment or the community, hold at least equal weighting as shareholders. And this is, an innovation that started in the US and now spread around the globe. Lots of countries in Europe and in South America have actually similar laws. Just, a number of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, Rwanda in Africa actually passed a similar law. So anyways, I think this is, the important thing is that it's not just about the companies, but actually about all these tools and processes that actually can engage investors, can engage policymakers. And overall then, it's, a network of these different actors that, come together and support and help one another. So I really do see it as more of a movement that is actually aiming to change, in some ways, the operating system of our global economy.
This is really something that I really like. When I also started, studying, getting involved, and also here in Africa through the B Lab, before East Africa and now Africa, movement is there. People are coming together. I recall even recently, even let's say Anthropic said, we are a public benefit corporation, the only one. So it's something that is discussing. And I want to discuss a bit this because, as I say, it seems unstoppable and it's still a lot of momentum. And more people are really understanding and finding the B. Actually, yesterday I traveled and in the airport I got a cup of coffee and with B Corporation. So I was like, wow. So it's also becoming also overseas now something and recognized also in our continent. But there's not been there has been some, let's say, debate in the recent years. So I wanted to discuss a bit, especially the latest development and how, the movement can reinvent themselves. Especially last year, there's been Dr. Bronner exit was a bit traumatic for the movement. So that they were saying that, there is no point just to level up. So we need to go further. So what they departure, expose about the movement direction. So is it going to lower the stand? How you, as a maximum expert on B Corp, react to that?
Yeah, and I've written a number of things about this issue. So, something specifically about the Dr. Bronner's exit in the Financial Times, but actually earlier than that, I had a number of sort of pieces that was quoted around. I think part of the issue that started the resistance of Dr. Bronner's and some other companies was the certification of Nespresso. This is a organization that makes, among other things, coffee pods, which for a variety of, obviously there's a lot of, potential waste with coffee pods. Also, I think in the past there was potential issues of, child and potentially slave labor in Nespresso's value chain. And I think they were making a good point. If you're going to have a standard, it has to mean something. And, if that is true that there's child labor and slave labor, what could there be that would disqualify a company? So I think that, the attention to these issues by Dr. Bronner's and other companies, I think is important because, in many ways, the B Corporation movement was very much about trying to push companies to be as positive on their social and environmental behaviors as possible. But also, I think it raised a lot of questions about actually, yes, we need to be actually making sure that companies may be doing positive things, but that in no way can sort of outweigh maybe negative things that they're doing. And I think it requires a need to assess the company in a much more holistic type of way.
And this is also a bit the discussion because in your book I recall, and also B Lab said we cannot just have the little cute business. I recall also, the book for Paul Polman, every company should become a B Corp even in spirit. And there hasn't been a tension, because between the little cute businesses, we had it also on the podcast, one of the, let's say, fast court in 2006 and 7. So little cute businesses, maybe in Oregon, maybe in Vermont. But now, how do you put together these two, the bigger company, the multinational, or people like Princess Polly, that people like in the movement became like obsessed. How you can get fast fashion on that? So, how do you reconcile those?
Yeah, it's a real good question, real big challenge. If I do think that in many ways the broader vision is to change the operating system of the global economy. When it requires policy, requires investors, requires companies, obviously. You need to have some way to engage larger organizations. That said, I do think that some companies might just be in industries or market segments where it's just not possible. So I don't actually know much about Princess Polly, to be honest, but I do. Obviously, fast fashion is an industry that, I don't, I think that just by definition should probably be disqualified. This is you know, an industry that is promoting, consumption of low quality, poor environmentally sourced, likely poor labor conditions, So I think, fast fashion is a type of organization or types of industry that should not be a B Corp. And another one that is a common B Corp, but that I find a little problematic is like bottled water. So this is another thing where, you have, I mean, of course, there are times, and I have bottled water free frequently. It's not like I'm some saint that is, 100% of the time having a bottle with me and using, water from a tap. I mean, so I don't have any judgment against people that use bottled water, but I think that industry in and of itself, encourages, use of plastic, use of disposable when we should be actually using, using the tap much more. So my sense is that, one of the reasons why even I wrote the book and I've, now been studying B Lab for 17 years, I guess, it's an organization that I really think learns. And I don't think that they are an organization that, you know, in many ways, insists, we've been doing it this way, this is right. They see how the world is changing. They actually are actors that are helping change the definition of what responsible and sustainable business is. They're changing the standards. They're changing and inspiring many companies. So I think the important thing is that they need to be that they are someone who are open to change. And similar to the Dr. Bronner's example, I think that they may not have appreciated it at the time, but I think at the end of the day, that the B Lab system is going to be more rigorous, and I think that overall, the B Corps and those of us that are in the movement will be better served.
And this is also, I mean, the response, no, a bit of this request from the movement, and it's also difficult, within the movement there are many voices. That's the beauty of democracy. I mean, when you have movements, you have different souls. There are people more, maybe more, let's say, open. Some people that are more pure, others. But that is the beauty of democracy and work. And one of the things to respond, to the call of being strict and rigorous is the new standards, which they are now in the process of rolling out, and seems also they have tightened a bit the nuts and bolts on that. However, there is some tension about the numbers and the progression and the continuing improvement that was there. Which is your take on the new standards?
Yeah, in general, I'm a supporter of the new standards, in line with what we were just talking a bit about. I do think that, if a company is going to be seen as truly a sustainable and, social impact company, you can't, weigh the environment being really good and then have poor labor practices or vice versa. So I really do think that there needs to be some baseline standard for all types of the corporate activities. I think that some people think that maybe those standards might be too high, and as a result, a lot of B Corps will not be able to certify. I talked to some people, like for instance, in the U.S. South, where maybe there's not as progressive a sort of ethos. It's not the Vermont or Oregon that you mentioned earlier, and they think that many of the B Corps they just won't engage with it because it's just too far for them, and I think that's a risk. But I think that we're evolving in how we assess sustainable business, and I think that actually having a system like this is really important.
That is also, it's really important how to work, how to balance, and in a movement, that is all the different area. And one also thing is that the B Corp, let's say 20 years ago, covered a vacuum. It was an off-the-shelf product that with an assessment, the work, then the questionnaire, that really helped companies to become sustainable. Because actually now I think there are 10,000, but I think hundreds of thousands have done the questionnaire. They are really also work on that. So now with let's say, regulators catching up, especially maybe not in the US, but in Europe and other UDR compliance and other, is there a risk that is becoming like B Corp is out of date because regulation are catching up and it is like a standard that is no longer required?
No, I mean, I almost see it the opposite, actually. I mean, my belief is that, if you think about the B Lab, as an NGO with a mission and a theory of change, actually getting these ideas embedded in laws is in some ways like the gold standard of success. And I mean, I know, some of the European, like the corporate sustainability, corporate sustainability reporting directive, the corporate sustainability due diligence directive. I mean, actually, B Lab was useful to the EU Commission in trying to help sort of understand and set some of those different standards. I think in Brazil too, there's some example where Sistema B in Brazil is engaging with, the regulators around the stock market, ESG reporting and compliance, and so I think that this is a movement. Actually, I think also is a useful type of metaphor because it does suggest sort of moving forward. And sure, 2006 when Bart Houlihan, one of the co-founders at B Lab, was sort of pulling a bunch of different ideas from various books and other minor systems into a spreadsheet to make the first B impact assessment. As you mentioned, this was in some ways virgin territory. There was not really a lot of systems. Maybe the Global Reporting Initiative was around then, but I think this is in some ways the way the movement should be pushing. And I think that actually this work that's being done in the EU, unfortunately, I think a lot of that work has actually been delayed or scaled back a bit in recent years. But I think this is really important.
And really, I want to touch a bit on the philosophy that was behind it, especially also touching in the latest book, the Profiteers. Companies really externalize in a way social costs and just incorporate profits. We see now, especially in the world of fortresses, especially US or even other blocks that follow, some also an extent going to predatory capitalism with inequalities going, to the roof. So how do you see the movement, how we can shift more? And is this still relevant, maybe from you, to the purpose-driven businesses, or are we on retreat?
I mean, I do think that there is a little bit of retreat. I mentioned, I know some regulations in the EU that I was very optimistic about, like this, corporate sustainability reporting directive, have been weakened and delayed. The US obviously is retreat is not even violent resistance, I think, might be a better way to put it. I mean, there has been a strong backlash against anything sustainable ESG. But I think that, my sad sense, and it's a sad reason why I believe this, climate change is not getting any better. Inequality, as you mentioned, has just increased tremendously. There's issues of, discrimination that, all of which suggest that the tomorrow's business world is going to be much more challenging for business along these issues. And I think it's going to require a lot of thoughtful action, both on the voluntary side from companies, where I think a lot of innovation gets done, but then also on, the part of policy. And so I think that, I think we're not in a good space right now, but in many ways, if you think particularly in the US, a lot of that backlash, I think, was a result of actually because there was a lot of success in actually moving things forward. And so you have this really, violent pullback. And but like I mentioned, I think sadly, many of the, in some ways, polycrisis type trends that are occurring in the world are just going to make this type of work more and more important.
And actually, I believe so, because the problems are not going away, maybe are swept under the carpet. So we need really to push. And let's say the 2010s, maybe the stakeholder capitalism, the year 2000 was the stakeholder capitalism, this better business. Do you see a new framing, maybe from your academic perspective now, that we can use nowadays?
I mean, I do think that, and this is in some ways what I'm trying to do in the Profiteers, and in some ways where I see the new B Corp standards. There's also, you mentioned Dr. Bronner's and some other businesses are engaging in something called the Purpose Pledge. I personally, I think a big challenge and big problem with stakeholder capitalism is that it was sort of akin, the weaknesses were akin to the weaknesses of the prior B Corp assessment system, where companies can do all these very positive things, but actually people are not really checking what kind of negative things they're doing. And so I think that what we need is to be much more comprehensive in assessing companies' damage to the world alongside the positive things. And I think that, thinking about something like purpose or impact and having it be not just selective positives, but actually an assessment of the holistic organization. And I think both the B impact or the new version of the B Corp assessment and this purpose pledge, I think one of the reasons why I think they're important, both of them set about ways of trying to think about assessing the holistic organization, but also they're about recognizing that this is not the natural way the system is set up, and companies need help and networks and time to actually to make these changes. And so they're both in some ways, frameworks slash assessments, but also networks and communities of change. So I think that that's in some ways the way we need to head. How that gets, you know, conceptualized in a pithy way, like stakeholder capitalism. Maybe it's something around purpose, impact. I'm not sure what it is, but I think that there's something there.
And this is very important. And especially, I want to, as we are in the global south, and sometimes global south can really, I was in a conference and then say the global, so we still have time to not use and make the same mistake that were done maybe in Asia or in Western Europe or in the US to destroy the environment, especially the population is booming, the economy is growing. So which models and how we can really use here in the global south, which model we can use not to avoid those type of mistakes?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I do think that the B Corp, at least the company level, if you're, starting a company, you want to be sustainable, or you have a company and you want to make it more sustainable. I do think that the B Corp sort of tools and processes are very helpful ways to actually, in some ways level up on, your variety of sustainability areas. And, hundreds of companies have told me that, this has really helped propel their impact across different areas. So I think that's, really, really important. I do think that, there's still a lot of growth on the idea of sustainable business in the global south. I mean, in Latin America, at least, there's a robust B Corp infrastructure, Sistema B. However, I do think the sustainability ethos more broadly is not as deep there. But I think that those entrepreneurs are very active in trying to change that. As I mentioned, there's this work between Sistema B and the stock market, the B3. I was in Sao Paulo. I took some students there maybe a year and a half, maybe a little over a year ago. And Sistema B, organized something where I actually went to the major stock exchange, the B3, and gave a talk to, their various constituent companies in the stock market that wanted to come and learn about this. So I do think that there is, growth there. I think Asia too is a booming area. There's actually in about a month or so, I'm going to be going to Kuala Lumpur. There is a B Corp Asia summit where I think there'll be hundreds of B Corps from around Asia coming together to engage and learn about things. Africa, I think, is still a little behind Latin America and Southeast Asia/Asia. So I think there's still lots of growth, basically.
And I think it's important. We also need to consider, the growth of the market and sometimes the voids that we have to get, with the many crises that sometimes for businesses, sustainability is there, maybe is a need, and they have maybe a social ethos, but on the other side, it's quite difficult, to survive. And a question about this, because there is a lot of, we had a lot of another stream of your research is about China and the work that you have done and support. So we have discussed a lot, and perspective in the global south and other guests, really they were positive, about the work of China, the support, and maybe especially maybe when you talk with Western people, US is the like anathema, like talk about Soviet Union in the 1950s. So and I want to say that I've learned a lot from Mount the Market, one of the best book I ever read. Actually, I really enjoyed. So can you tell us a bit more? What is the role, since you have studied in depth China for many, many years. Which is the role of this sometimes black box that is portrayed as a good innovator or like the dragon and the enemy on the other side?
Yeah, I do think that, and we're seeing this in other places around the world with the rise of authoritarianism. I do think that in general, authoritarian regimes are destructive to the world. I think that they, significantly limit, the freedom of their residents, and they end up creating a lot of problems in the countries, as we're seeing in the U.S. right now. So I do think there are challenges that China has because of the sort of the power of the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping over everything, and things end up becoming much more ideologically driven as opposed to being driven by sort of expertise and human rights and various things. But I think partly underlying your question was the amazing progress China has made in a variety of, clean tech isn't exactly the right way to put it. A variety of, electric cars, batteries, solar, wind, and I think this is where you see, where if you have an authoritarian regime that is not just strictly ideologically driven, like I think, in the US, all those different industries Trump is trying to kill because he is bought off by the fossil fuel industry and has some bizarre, I don't know, bias against like wind power and various things, and spending all kinds of money to actually kill projects that are almost done. And, the time with the war in Iran, there's, energy security is more important than ever. So it's totally illogical. But I think China, they realize they're a country that does not have the same natural resources as the US. They see actually electrification, clean energy as a mechanism both for energy security, but also, an amazing industry to lead on and dominate in the future, because, that is the way the world is heading, not just because of climate, but, it's cheaper. You look at, solar in particular is way cheaper than fossil fuels nowadays. Wind, I think also. You have electric cars that, for a variety of reasons, are more efficient and moving down the cost curve, particularly the Chinese ones of those. So, China both sees it from a domestic energy security great opportunity, but also a global dominance type of perspective too. So, the leading car companies in the world 10 years from now, very likely may be Chinese. Because as they're the ones that have the best reasonably priced electric vehicles. So I think, although I'm very skeptical about the leadership of China on this one issue, I think they are a tremendous force to be reckoned with. And I think that, we need actually that innovation and that focus on those industries. So from that perspective, I'm a fan.
Let's say we have, it is not black or white, but I read your book, and your book has spread my interest in China. Now I'm reading another one, they're talking the engineer state. So the engineer state is very good. Yeah, yeah. So that one was very good in one side, but on the other side, the real strangling, of freedom and what was in other area, and the increasing role of the state in controlling every single aspect of the life, which can be worrisome, especially now with the rise of artificial intelligence, and everything is more and more, powerful. So as a last question, how do you see, before our message to the audience, it's really, how do you see the world evolving, from your perspective as an academic, the future of capitalism and this poly-crisis that are really killing us, and with war all over the places. So let's say if you have to fast forward in 10 years, where do you see our plan? Will we really solve the 2030 and 2050, or we will go backward?
Yeah, good question. The short answer is, we're in a period of tremendous uncertainty, and it's hard to predict, but I'll sort of play along. And I'm more optimistic now than I was a year or so ago. I really was very pessimistic. For the first part of Trump's term, he had tremendous amounts of success, and everyone was basically folding to him, which was very worrying. I think that, he's finally people are standing up to him. And I think that it's that once they realize, once you stand up to a bully, actually the bully is not really made of anything. And so people are having a lot of success with that, and it's not going to, I don't think that's going to stop. So I think that the U.S. will be able to pull, a lot of things have been destroyed as far as, international development, research infrastructure, clean energy, which we talked about, which I think will set the U.S. back quite a bit. But I do think that, we'll emerge in a way that actually will help even double down on some of these topics. And so I do think that the way the world is moving to being more sustainable, I think is going to be, we're going to have a positive trajectory towards 2030 and 2050. I think that, it might actually be, and this is the partial negative, you have this sort of K-shaped economy or K-shaped recovery. I think after COVID, they called it, where, you do have the situation where the rich are getting richer. So I do think that, my comments are very much regarding the developed, like the Europe and America. But I need to think more, and because I do think that as those regions are doing really well, I think there is the potential, given issues of climate change are going to actually be hitting the global South a lot more severely. I think that, there's a potential for things in the global South to get worse and worse. So, that's sort of the K. So, sort of the developed world moving on the upward slope, and then, potentially global South or regions that are very susceptible to climate change will moving on the downward slope, given we'll have, a lot more heat and droughts and, lack of water and other climate disasters. I think that's something where, we all need to be thinking much more about, how to increase resilience and livability, of all regions of the world. So I guess that's, not really thought a ton about it, but I do think, we need to be thinking that it's very easy to get in one of these sort of K-shaped continue. I mean, the world has been sort of this K-shaped type of thing for a long time, as far as the divergence of the global North and global South, so to speak. And I think it's going to potentially can get even worse if we don't pay attention to it.
Yeah, exactly. And certainly we can see it with drought or excess flooding and disaster, which are really eating the people that have not contributed, or they contributed very little to the issue. And as we close the episode, I want to, how do you see, I mean, for our people listening, and sometimes I know we have been discouraging in the process and the other, but is there still space for better business? What do you want to leave us, to people listening all over the world?
I think this is, human creativity, entrepreneurship, I think, are tremendous engines to make the world better. And I think, I really hope that, your listeners, other people that are involved in the global B Corp movement will continue on that path, because, I do think in many cases, we do need to get sustainability to be more deeply embedded in policy if we're really going to make the world better. But the type of innovations, proof of business cases, actually, that can't happen without actually, deep focus at the grassroots, and the grassroots being sort of the entrepreneurs. So I do hope that that's something, I do think that for the entrepreneurs, and particularly B Corps that listen to your program, that they're providing a very valuable service, and to keep doing it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. It's been a pleasure, as always, having you, and thank you for sharing your insights.
Great. Thanks so much, Samuel. Always enjoy talking to you.
Are you satisfied after this wonderful episode? Let's continue together our sustainability journey.